Chapter 10. New York County Assistant District Attorney Dennis Keneally looked up over the rims of his half glasses as I walked into his office. "Nice hat," he snorted, referring to my Cravens Mavens baseball cap. It was a gift from my teammates on the moot court team in the J. Braxton Craven Memorial Constitutional Law Competition. "You're just jealous because you didn't get one. I don't need souvenirs to remind me of my bygone glory days. I'm still living mine. I'm wearing this to cover up a souvenir I got last night." I took off the cap and turned around, displaying the 4 square inches of shaved scalp and 16 stitches. Ouch. Retirement must be dangerous. Nah, mostly it's boring. I still don't understand what you're doing managing an apartment building. A bad day fixing toilets is better than a good day practicing law. Fixing toilets sounds like what I do around here. Yeah, difference is you love it. Unclogging the system, flushing away the crap. That I do, that I do. Keneally's feet were up on his desk, a file resting on his knees. He shook his head. He had the bored affect, deadpan delivery, and gravelly nasal quality peculiar to those New York Irish who usually end up in law enforcement disposing of perps and skells. Unlike most of his family, however, Keneally had gone to law school instead of ending up on the job. A crackerjack prosecutor in the Homicide Bureau, he was also one of my closest friends. "So what do you need?" "Maybe I just wanted to see you. You show up here before noon, when I'm sure you usually don't get up until much later. We don't have an appointment." "Since when do I need an appointment?" I interrupted. "You sweet talk your way past Maisie." He was right. I'd brought his secretary chocolate so I could get in to see him unannounced. "You got bonked on the head last night, and you've got a shit-eating grin on your face. So what do you need?" "You got to get out of this place. It's giving you a very jaded view of the world, very cynical. I stopped in to buy you lunch." "It's 10 o'clock in the morning." "Not now. I don't want to have lunch now. What are you, crazy? I want to have lunch at lunchtime." "Today?" "Sure, today. Why not today? Unless you can't get a hold of the autopsy report I need, in which case I'd be happy to buy you lunch tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever you can get a hold of it." "When did this guy kick off?" "A week ago last Tuesday." "Then I'll be able to get it for you today, if I get it for you at all." He looked at me appraisingly. "Why, pray tell, do you need a copy of an autopsy report?" "I'm trying to answer some questions for a friend." I told him the tale of Cynthia, the death of Alex, the insinuations of the homicide cops that we had somehow tampered with Alex's body after his death and transformed the scene of his supposedly accidental death into a crime scene. "I'm sure they weren't serious. Sounds like you pissed them off and they want to de-yank your chain a little." "That might be," I said, "but there are a couple of other things." I told him of Cynthia's doubts and her assertion that it was impossible that Alex had been engaged in autoerotic asphyxiation. "Nobody ever wants to believe that someone they love committed suicide," Keneally pointed out, "and the same thing is often true with autoerotic asphyxiation." I know, but there's a lot of weirdness around this thing." I didn't want to tell Keneally about my run-in with Sally. He was a prosecutor. That and his family ties made him enough of a cop that he might side with her and decide I shouldn't get the information I was after. "Also," I continued, "I know it wasn't autoerotic asphyxiation. Alex was alive when we left that apartment, and he was dead when his neighbor found him. I was with Cynthia all night. She couldn't have cleaned up the scene. And I know I didn't clean it up with her. You know that too. You know me, even if the cops don't. Everybody thinks they know their friends and what they're capable of. One thing you learn in this job is that no one really knows anyone, and we're all capable of anything. I thought I knew you, but you've done some weird shit. Quitting a lucrative law practice and becoming a janitor? Thanks. It could have been someone else, you know." "How do you mean?" "A lot of times, erotic asphyxiation isn't auto. It can involve two people, part of an S&M kind of thing. I know. Look, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, I just want to find out what the autopsy says. Maybe that will give me something to sell Cynthia so she can sleep at night. More like so she can sleep with you at night. Well, yes, there's that. Great. We at the New York County DA's office are always more than happy to help you get laid. I smiled at him. Okay, he said. I'll see what I can do and I'll call you. And you're buying lunch. I smiled again. Great, I said. A big, expensive lunch. Right. Now get out of here, he said, reaching for the phone. Some of us have work to do. Okie doke. And don't go too far. I might want my free lunch today. No such thing as a free lunch, I said. Don't I know it? Outside, with time to kill, I turned south on Center Street. I thought about Sally and what she had been up to in that bar. It made sense that she would want to get me out of there before I said anything that would spill the beans that she was a cop. But what was all the hostility about once we were on the street? Why did she think I was mucking about in an investigation? As far as I knew, there was no investigation into Alex's death, unless the cops thought that someone other than Cynthia and I had been there and covered it up. I passed the Strand Book Annex on Fulton Street. I'd never been inside, but if it was anywhere near as good as its sister store on Broadway and 12th, it was worth a look. I perused some elementary texts on linguistics, a topic about which I knew nothing. I pulled a copy of Teach Yourself Linguistics by Jean Aitchison, looked at the table of contents. It looked like it would give me enough of an overview to let me know if I wanted to delve into the topic any deeper, maybe try to tackle some Chomsky or Echo. Next, I looked in the reference section and found a first edition of the Times Concise Atlas of World History, published in London in 1978. A year or so before, I'd spent an hour with a copy at an incredibly boring party. I had coveted it ever since. The detailed maps of military campaigns, changing borders, and population migrations would add a third dimension to my otherwise thin understanding of history. When I left the bookstore, it was still too early for a beer. So at Water Street, I headed south to number 90, a small brownstone oddly tucked in among the tall modern buildings that housed much of the city's and the world's financial apparatus. I climbed up the two worn steps, opened the door, and heard the tinkle of the bell as I entered the small shop. My nostrils were immediately assaulted by 1,000 scents, all mixed together into an overwhelming, unidentifiable miasma. The walls of the cramped room were lined with small bottles and boxes, and wherever there was a gap, a card or letter was taped up, praising the wares of this small establishment. I read them yet again while I waited for someone to respond to the bell. I don't like to pay a premium for the privilege of putting something on my skin after shaving that doesn't smell like medicine, and I know that a huge percentage of every dollar spent on aftershave lotions and balms goes to whatever top designer licensed his name to the product and to the advertising budget and packaging. This tiny store, Essential Products, was a manufacturer of interpretations of most popular perfumes and colognes, a well-kept secret, one of the little gems that make New York what it is. Leo introduced me to this place, and it saved me a couple of $100 a year. For $11, I can get a 4-ounce bottle imitation of any scent. For less than $4, I can pick up a huge pump bottle of Trader Joe's moisturizer, and voila, a cheap aftershave balm as good as the real thing. A man of late middle age came out from the back room, wiping his hands on a small towel. "Can I help you?" he asked, peering at me through thick glasses. "Yes, 2 bottles of number 75, please." "Number 75, number 75. Oh, it's you." "Yes, it's me. I keep coming back." "Everybody does once they find us," he said, craning his neck to look at a high shelf through the bottom half of his bifocals. "Number 75. Ah, yes, here we go." He pulled two small boxes off the shelf. Anything else? He asked, wrapping the boxes up together in brown paper. No, that will do it. I paid and thanked him as I put the package in my backpack. Outside, the brisk breeze coming off the water quickly dispelled the shop's cacophony of odors and replaced it with the hint of salt air backed by more than a hint of the Fulton Fish Market to the northeast. By now, the sun was over the yardarm. It always is, somewhere. I picked up a newspaper from a vending box and walked north. When the plaza of the seaport opened up to my right, I walked over the wet cobblestones to Il Porto, took a seat at the Raw Bar, ordered a half-dozen Kumamotos and a pint of Dock Street IPA, and opened the paper to the crossword. It was Fridays, the toughest of the weekday puzzles. I was done with the oysters and almost done with the puzzle when my phone rang. It was Keneally. This lunch better be good. I'm at Il Porto in the seaport if you want to join me, or I can meet you somewhere else. I don't have the luxury of time. Get your ass back here and we'll go over what I've got. I'll collect my lunch some other day. I'm on my way. I dropped a few bills on the bar and drained the last of my beer. I pulled the page with the crossword puzzle and put it in my pocket to finish later. Back in Keneally's office, he still had a file on his lap and his feet up on his desk. He handed me a folder and tapped his desk with a pencil as he talked on the phone. I sat and opened the folder. Inside were 10 or 11 faxed pages. The first bore the simple heading Autopsy in bold-faced caps. I skimmed the information on the external examination, significant scars, postmortem changes, description of clothing, received in separate bags, and finding of clothing. I read more carefully at the evidence of injuries, trauma to the bridge of the nose, and indications that it was antemortem. I don't know how to read these things, but two items jumped out. The first was regarding the hands. Quote, paper bags are secured to the hands for evidentiary recovery purposes. On removal of the bags, the fingernails are intact without foreign material within the nail beds. Fingernail clippings are obtained and placed into appropriately labeled evidence containers and into evidence. Foreign adhesive-like material is evident circumferentially about both wrists, demonstrating a width of approximately 11 centimeters and associated with a corresponding paucity of hair. Swabs from the adhesive material are obtained and placed into evidence. End quote. The report went on to detail the neck injuries. Quote, multiple horizontally oriented linear abrasions with a width from 4 to 6 centimeters are on the mid aspect of the neck, centered 3 centimeters below the thyroid notch in the anterior midline extending to the frontal planes 11 centimeters below the auditory canals bilaterally. In addition, a single partially circumferential dry parchment-like abrasion of a similar width extends from the level of the thyroid notch upward and posterior to both ears. The horizontal abrasions are associated with extensive fresh contusion within the strap muscles of the anterior neck and fracture of the left thyroid cornu and the hyoid bone, both of which demonstrate fresh hemorrhage within the immediately surrounding soft tissues. End quote. Cause of death was listed in the report as asphyxiation. Manner of death was labeled apparent suicide. I skipped over the telephone notice of death and the identification of body forms from both the police and the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, then carefully read the toxicology report. Grass chromatography showed ethanol levels of 0.02 for blood and 0.03 for the brain. I think that meant he'd had a drink shortly before his death. The report also indicated that a color test failed to detect salicylates, that thin layer chromatography showed no acidic or neutral drugs, and that radioimmunoassay showed no opiates, benzoylaconium, or cannabinoids. Keneally wrapped up his phone call and dropped his feet to the floor. I was reading the supplemental case information form, which described the position of Alex's body. Sitting upright on the floor, his posterior slightly elevated, hanging by his neck from a length of material knotted around a pipe at ceiling level. Did you read all this? I asked. Yep. He didn't hang himself. Why do you say that? The way he was found. That's not how people hang themselves. They tie a noose and jump off a chair or something. Nah, Keneally shook his head. The neck breaking is only in the movies and in real life judicial hangings. The knot on a hangman's noose is a real piece of art. With suicides, too much goes wrong when they try to do that, so they usually end up just strangling themselves. Oh. What else jumps out at you? I think the cops are full of shit about it being an AEA. Why? Tell me what you see. You're going to play professor with me? Hey, I work for the state. Giving you a little information on the slide, that's one thing. Spoon feeding it to you? That's another. I considered all I had just read. Okay. It does look like someone else was involved. Why? A few things. The broken nose. Sometimes with suicide by hanging, you get a postmortem broken nose or even a skull fracture on the Vic when someone comes home, freaks, cuts them down, and they fall face first on the floor. He wasn't cut down. The neighbor who found him left him up there and called the cops. The broken nose was antemortem, so it must have bled a lot. But there wasn't a lot of blood at the scene, and there was none on his clothes, so either he cleaned himself off after he got his nose broken or someone else did. He didn't get into a fight, break his nose, clean up, and then hang himself in the time we were out to dinner. Also, you probably missed it, but the autopsy shows an aspiration pattern throughout the lungs. That means he inhaled his own blood, so he was definitely alive and breathing when his nose was broken. What else do you see in there? The tape residue and the hair torn away on his wrists. His wrists were taped, so someone else had to tape them up and then remove the tape later. That supports the S&M idea, but Cynthia says he wasn't into anything like that. She'd known him for years, lived with him for a while, and again, that kind of scenario is pretty far-fetched in the short time we were out for dinner. Keneally nodded. What else? Hey, I don't know how to read these things. I never worked homicide. I've got no background here. It just seems weird and everything conflicts. The cleaned up nose and the stuff with his wrists makes it look like someone else was involved, but there was no time for that. And when he was found, he was dressed. No skin magazines. He didn't have his dick in his hands. So that argues against AEA and makes it look like he just up and hung himself. Cynthia says that's not possible. I knew that was weak, but I still didn't want to clue him into the police involvement that was amping up my suspicions. I agree. I don't think he hung himself. So you think it was a kinky sex thing with someone else involved? He dies, the other person freaks, cleans him up, and books? No. What am I missing? You're missing the big inconsistencies. The bruising and abrasions on his neck are inconsistent with a suicide by hanging. With hanging, you get perimortem bruising that happens at the time of death, and maybe abrasions, all of which are clearly distinguishable from antemortem bruising. You don't get this kind of extensive antemortem bruising and this amount of abrasion unless the subject struggles and strangles slowly. But you just told me he would have been hanging there for a while, that it's not like he dropped from the chair in an instant and broke his neck. Right, but here there's a lot of bruising. In a hanging, you also get the classic V pattern running upwards from the point of the V just above the larynx. Here, the bruising runs straight back around his neck. That means he was strangled by someone else from behind. So it could have been something sexual that went south? Could have been, but I don't think so. From the amount of bruising and the abrasions, I think someone took his time, Keneally said. I think that what we have here is a homicide. And that is the end of chapter 10. If you haven't done it already, go to my website and sign up for my newsletter. You'll get notifications of these readings, and you'll also get lots of different articles that I put out on writing and on acting. And also jump on in and subscribe to this channel to get notifications of every live stream.